The Mistral wind howling outside their stone farmhouse usually brought Fergus a sense of peace, but tonight, it only amplified the heavy silence in his study. Jessamine was supposed to be in Paris for a veterinary symposium, saving stray animals and networking with European specialists. Instead, the glowing screen of Fergus's laptop displayed a finalized American Express receipt for a luxury, private cliffside villa in Corsica. It was booked for two, under her name, using the joint account meant for their organic seed business. A subtle, sickening realization washed over him. She wasn't saving animals. She was entertaining another man on his dime, right in the middle of the most critical harvest of their lives. If stories of profound betrayal hidden beneath the sun-drenched vines and lavender fields of Provence speak to you, stay with me. The heavy oak desk in the corner of the farmhouse study felt like an executioner's block. Outside, the notorious Mistral wind of Provence battered the heavy wooden shutters, a relentless howling that usually lulled Fergus to sleep after 14 hours of back-breaking labor in the organic fields. Tonight, however, the chill seeped straight into his bones. The glow of his laptop screen illuminated the deep lines around his eyes, lines earned from 7 years of fighting the stubborn, rocky soil of southern France. He had opened the joint farm account simply to pay the supplier for next season's heirloom tomato seeds. Instead, he found a glaring anomaly that stopped his breath in his throat. Debit, Les Falaces de Pienard Resort, Corsica. Fergus blinked, rubbing the rough calluses of his thumbs against his temples. There had to be a mistake. A fraudulent charge. Jessamine was in Paris. She had kissed his cheek 3 days ago, smelling of her signature bergamot perfume and veterinary antiseptic, claiming she needed to attend the European Veterinary Symposium. "It's good for the clinic, Ferge," she had said, her green eyes avoiding his as she zipped her leather weekender bag. "I'll network, maybe find an investor for the new ultrasound machine." His hand trembled slightly as he clicked on the transaction details. The charge wasn't just for a room. It was an all-inclusive honeymoon suite. Attached to the bank portal was an automated email receipt forwarded to their shared spam folder. He opened it. 2 names were listed under the guest registry. Jessamine Hayes, Julian St. James. The name hit Fergus like a physical blow to the stomach. Julian St. James, the slick, expat American lawyer who had been hanging around the village square, always dressed in linen suits that cost more than Fergus's tractor. More importantly, Julian was the legal counsel for Dorothea, the ruthless, wealthy landowner next door who had been trying to bleed Fergus dry in a boundary dispute for the last 8 months. Fergus leaned back in his leather chair, the leather creaking loudly in the empty house. The air suddenly felt too thin to breathe. He pictured his wife, his smart, pragmatic Jessamine, who had built this life with him from scratch, laughing on a sun-drenched balcony overlooking the Mediterranean. He pictured her touching another man, taking him on a lavish vacation, using the money Fergus had bled into the soil to earn. A wave of intense, suffocating nausea washed over him, followed quickly by a dark, chilling clarity. She hadn't just cheated on him. She had taken Dorothea's shark of a lawyer to a romantic paradise, funding the betrayal with the very farm she was legally bound to. The betrayal was so deep, so multi-layered, that the sheer audacity of it burned away Fergus's grief, leaving behind a cold, hard ember of absolute rage. He didn't scream. He didn't throw the laptop against the stone wall. Instead, Fergus slowly reached for his notebook, the one he usually used to track soil pH and harvest yields. He turned to a fresh page. The ink from his pen was black and uncompromising. If Jessamine wanted to play a game of secrets while his livelihood was on the line, she was about to learn that no one understood the concept of burying things deep in the dirt better than a farmer. Fergus closed the laptop. The wind outside continued to howl, but inside the study, a terrifying quiet had taken root. The sun rose over the Luberon Valley, casting a deceptive golden hue over the rolling acres of lobby. For Fergus, the morning light brought no warmth. He was out in the fields before the mist had even cleared, his hands sinking deep into the damp, loamy soil. The organic heirloom tomatoes, heavy and vibrant red on the vine, demanded to be harvested. It was backbreaking, relentless work, the kind that usually emptied his mind and grounded his soul. Today, however, every drop of sweat that stung his eyes only served as a reminder of his wife lounging by a pristine infinity pool in Corsica. He moved mechanically down the long rows of vines. Snap, twist, pull. The rhythmic sound of the harvest was drowned out by the deafening roar of his own thoughts. He pictured Julian St. James's manicured hands, the same hands that drafted hostile legal notices to steal Fergus's land, now touching Jessamyn's skin. The sheer indignity of it made his chest tighten so fiercely he had to stop and lean against a wooden trellis to catch his breath. His phone vibrated in the front pocket of his canvas overalls. Fergus pulled it out, his dirt-stained fingers smudging the glass screen. It was a text from Jessamyn. The morning lectures are exhausting, but Paris is beautiful today. Miss you and the farm. Don't work too hard. Hugs and kisses. A hollow, humorless sound escaped his throat. The casual cruelty of the message was staggering. She was likely lying in a luxurious bed, the Mediterranean breeze fluttering through sheer curtains, typing out a fabricated reality with practiced ease. Fergus stared at the blinking cursor on his screen. His thumb hovered over the keyboard. It would be so easy to shatter her illusion. Just one sentence. How is the water in Corsica? But as he looked out over the vast expanse of his land, the lavender fields waiting for the next season, the ancient olive grove he had spent 2 years nursing back to health, his survival instinct clamped down on his anger. If he blew the secret now, she would panic. She would delete the evidence, hire her own vicious representation, and worse, Julian would have the upper hand in the boundary dispute. He could lose the farm to Dorothea simply because his heart was broken. Fergus slid the phone back into his pocket without replying. He needed to be smarter than his grief. By nightfall, his muscles ached with a dull, throbbing pain, but his mind was sharp and restless. The farmhouse was agonizingly quiet. He walked into the kitchen, his boots leaving faint traces of dust on the terracotta tiles. On the counter sat Jessamyn's older model iPad, a device she mostly used for reading veterinary journals and storing old recipes. He picked it up. It wasn't passcode protected. Fergus carried the tablet to the heavy oak dining table, the same table where they had signed the deed to this property 7 years ago. He opened her email application. She had logged out of her primary account, but the device's internal cloud syncing had been notoriously glitchy since the last software update. He dug into the hidden folders, navigating the digital labyrinth with cold, methodical precision. It did not take long to find the breadcrumbs. Under a secondary, obscure email address disguised as a newsletter subscription, the truth spilled out in black and white. Flight confirmations, dinner reservations at a Michelin-starred restaurant on the cliffs of Piana. And then, the messages. He didn't read the explicit details. He didn't need to torture himself further. But one sentence, sent by Julian 2 weeks prior, burned itself into his retinas. Keep the dirt farmer busy with the harvest, Jess. Once Dorothea gets the northern ridge, we'll have more than enough to buy that place in Monaco. Fergus carefully set the iPad down. The betrayal was not just a matter of the flesh. It was a calculated, financial assassination. They were not just taking his wife. They were trying to steal his life's work. The sadness evaporated entirely, replaced by a terrifying, absolute stillness. The crunch of expensive tires on the crushed limestone driveway was a sound that did not belong at Laub. Fergus paused, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of a dirt-caked forearm. Through the shimmering heat distortion rising from the tractor's hood, he watched a sleek, black Mercedes sedan glide to a halt near the old stone barn. The driver's door opened, and Dorothea emerged. Even standing in the middle of a working agricultural zone, the wealthy landowner looked as though she had just stepped out of a private salon in Monaco. She wore a pristine white linen suit that defied the omnipresent Provençal dust, her silver hair cut into a sharp, unforgiving bob. She adjusted her designer sunglasses, scanning the property with the calculating gaze of a vulture assessing a wounded animal. Fergus slowly climbed down from the tractor, his heavy boots thudding against the dry earth. He approached her with deliberate, measured steps. The scent of her heavy, floral perfume clashed violently with the natural, sharp aroma of crushed lavender and damp soil. "Good afternoon, Fergus," Dorothea purred, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. She did not extend a hand. She knew better than to risk touching the dirt that stained his calloused skin. "Dorothea," he replied, his tone perfectly flat. "You're a long way from the manor. If you're looking for Jessamyn, she's at a symposium in Paris." A slow, Knowing smile spread across Dorothea's crimson-painted lips. The smile chilled Fergus to the marrow. Yes, I heard she was traveling. Such a dedicated woman, your wife. Always putting her passions first. Fergus kept his facial muscles entirely still. Did she know? The way she lingered on the word passions suggested a terrifying possibility. Perhaps Julian wasn't just acting on his own predatory instincts. Perhaps Dorothea had encouraged her lawyer to compromise the enemy's wife. I'm here about the northern ridge, Fergus, Dorothea continued, stepping closer, her heels sinking slightly into the dirt. My legal team is prepared to file the final injunction by the end of the month. I thought I would extend one last courtesy. Sell me those 20 acres now, and I'll ensure you walk away with enough capital to keep this little farming hobby of yours afloat for a few more years. Fergus looked past her, toward the rolling hills that separated their properties. Those 20 acres were the lifeblood of his irrigation system. Losing them meant losing Laub. Julian St. James has been working very hard on this case, Dorothea added softly, her eyes glinting behind the dark lenses. He assures me the deed structure is quite fragile. He is very confident we will win. Exceptionally confident. The words echoed in Fergus's mind. Keep the dirt farmer busy with the harvest, Jess. He understood now. Dorothea's arrogance wasn't just born of wealth, it was born of inside information. Julian was feeding her the weaknesses of Fergus's farm, vulnerabilities he was undoubtedly extracting from Jessamine in between their romantic dinners in Corsica. They thought he was blind. They thought he was nothing more than a slow, stubborn man obsessed with dirt, entirely ignorant of the vipers circling his home. I appreciate your concern, Dorothea, Fergus said, his voice surprisingly steady, adopting the mild, weary tone they expected from him. But my wife and I built this place together. We'll let the courts decide the boundaries. Dorothea gave a small, pitying sigh, as if dealing with a stubborn child. As you wish, Fergus. But remember, the ground beneath your feet can shift much faster than you anticipate. She turned and folded herself back into the luxurious interior of the Mercedes. Fergus watched the car kick up a cloud of white dust as it retreated down the lane. He stood completely still until the dust settled back onto the grapevines. He was bleeding from 1,000 invisible cuts, but for the first time since discovering the receipt, he felt a dark, stabilizing focus. They had grossly miscalculated the resilience of a man who spent his life studying the slow, inevitable rot beneath the surface. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel drive sent a jolt of pure adrenaline straight to Fergus's chest, sharp as a physical blow. He was in the barn, meticulously cleaning the rusted blades of his old tiller, his hands black with grease. For a long, suffocating moment, he squeezed his eyes shut. Brief. He had spent 3 days practicing this exact moment, burying his rage beneath layers of practiced indifference. But the reality of her arrival was a terrifying test of endurance. He wiped his hands on a rag and stepped out into the blinding midday sun of Provence. Jessamine was dragging her vintage leather weekender bag from the trunk of her small, sensible Renault. She looked radiant. Her skin, usually pale from long hours under the fluorescent lights of the veterinary clinic, was glowing with a deep, golden tan that no Parisian conference room could ever provide. She wore a breezy, expensive-looking sundress he had never seen before, white linen that fluttered against her legs in the Mistral wind. She spotted him and froze for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something unreadable passing behind her eyes before she plastered on a bright, exhausted smile. "Ferg," she called out, dropping the bag and walking toward him. Her steps were light, almost buoyant. Fergus forced the corners of his mouth upward. He met her halfway across the dusty courtyard. As she wrapped her arms around his neck, the scent of her usual bergamot perfume was entirely absent. Instead, she smelled faintly of expensive coconut sunblock and the salty, unmistakable tang of the Mediterranean Sea. It took every ounce of his willpower not to physically recoil from the touch of her warm skin against his chest. "Welcome home, Jess," he murmured into her hair, his voice rough. He hugged her back, feeling the familiar curve of her spine, a sickening wave of grief warring with his cold fury. "How was Paris?" She pulled back, sighing heavily as she brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "Exhausting. Absolutely brutal. The seminars on equine joint therapies went on forever, and the smog," Ferge, it was awful. I barely saw the sun. Fergus looked at the unmistakable tan line peeking out from the strap of her sundress. He kept his expression entirely blank, an intricate mask of a tired, loving husband. It sounds awful. You look like you need a vacation just to recover from the trip. Jessamine let out a short, tight laugh. Tell me about it. I'm just glad to be back in the fresh air. She looked around the courtyard, her gaze avoiding the heavy, unblinking stare he was desperately trying to soften. How was the harvest? Did the irrigation pump hold up? It held, Fergus said, picking up her heavy bag. It felt significantly lighter than when she had left, likely emptied of the heavy textbooks she claimed to be taking. I managed. The tomatoes are mostly in. We'll have enough to cover the winter seeds, maybe even a little extra. That's wonderful, sweetheart, she said, falling into step beside him as they walked toward the farmhouse. The casual endearment scraped against his raw nerves like sandpaper. Inside the cool, stone-walled kitchen, the silence between them felt infinitely heavier than before she left. She immediately went to the sink, splashing water on her face, the water darkening the pristine white of her dress. Fergus watched her movements, the familiar way she tilted her head, the way her hands moved. She was a stranger wearing his wife's face. I bought you something, she said suddenly, turning around and drying her hands on a dish towel. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, rectangular box wrapped in elegant silver paper. From a little boutique near the Champs-Élysées. Fergus took the box. His hands were remarkably steady. He unwrapped the paper slowly, revealing a sleek, expensive fountain pen. The brand was distinctly Italian. He knew exactly where she had bought it. The boutique was likely nestled in the same high-end plaza in Corsica where she and Julian had dined. It's beautiful, Jess, he said, his voice dropping to a low, quiet register. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. I'll use it to sign the new agricultural tax forms next week. They're very important. A shadow passed over Jessamine's face, a microscopic tightening of her jaw before she smiled again. Good. I'm glad you like it. I'm going to take a long shower. I feel covered in city grime. Fergus stood alone in the kitchen, turning the cold metal of the pen over in his calloused hands. She had brought him a weapon, completely unaware that he intended to use it to write the ending of their story. The fountain pen Jessamine had brought from Paris sat like a poisoned chalice on Fergus's scarred oak desk. For 3 days since her return, he had played the part of the devoted, exhausted farmer, listening to her fabricated tales of veterinary lectures while his skin crawled every time she touched him. He was a ghost haunting his own life, moving through the motions of harvesting the late-season zucchini while his mind meticulously plotted a legal execution. He waited until she left for the clinic in the village, the tires of her Renault spitting gravel as she sped away, likely eager to text Julian from the safety of her office. The moment the dust settled, Fergus locked the study door, pulled down the heavy canvas shades, and opened his laptop. The screen cast a pale, unforgiving light on his exhausted features. He had spent hours navigating the murky waters of the dark web to find a private investigator based out of Marseille, someone discreet, ruthless, and entirely uninterested in the quaint gossip of their Provençal village. A man named Bouchard. Fergus initiated the secure video call. The screen flickered, revealing a cramped, smoke-filled office and a man with a graying beard and sharp, cynical eyes. Monsieur Hayes, Bouchard rasped in heavily accented English, adjusting his webcam. I received the retainer. The wire transfer cleared this morning. I have the preliminary file on your wife and Julian St. James. Fergus felt a sickening lurch in his stomach, a physical manifestation of the finality of this moment. Once he saw the proof, there was no going back. Show me. Bouchard clicked his tongue, a sound of professional detachment, and began transmitting a series of encrypted files. They populated on Fergus's screen in a grid of undeniable betrayal. The first file contained high-resolution photographs taken by a contact Bouchard had in Corsica. There was Jessamine, wearing the same white sundress she had returned in, laughing on the deck of a private yacht. Next to her, his hand resting familiarly on the small of her bare back, was Julian. The lawyer was tanned and relaxed, a stark contrast to the aggressive, shark-like demeanor he displayed in the local courthouse. They were very public about it, monsieur, Bouchard said, his voice void of pity. Dinner at Le Pirate, a private charter to the Calanques de Piana. She paid for everything with the American Express card you provided. Fergus stared at the images until his vision blurred. He forced himself to look away, clicking on the next folder. This one was far more dangerous than simple adultery. It contained financial records and legal filings. You asked me to look into St. James's connection to Dorothea, Bouchard continued, leaning closer to the camera, the glow of his cigarette illuminating his face. This is where your instinct was correct. It is not just an affair. It is a conflict of interest that would have him disbarred in the States and heavily fined here. Fergus leaned in, his heart hammering against his ribs. Explain. St. James is the primary partner at the firm representing Dorothea in your land dispute, Bouchard explained, pulling up a scanned document covered in French legalese. But look at this holding company. Société Civile Immobilière Lobby. It was registered 2 weeks ago in Monaco. The primary beneficiary is Julian St. James. The secondary beneficiary is your wife. The blood drained entirely from Fergus's face. He traced the lines of text with a trembling finger. They weren't just waiting for Dorothea to win the lawsuit to buy a house in Monaco. Julian was actively setting up a shell corporation to purchase the disputed 20 acres from Dorothea the moment she stole them from Fergus. And Jessamine, his wife, the woman who had helped him plant the very first olive tree on this land, was listed as a partner in the theft. She's helping him, Fergus whispered, the horrifying realization clicking into place. She's feeding him our financial vulnerabilities so he knows exactly how hard to push the lawsuit. Precisely, Bouchard confirmed grimly. She knows you are cash poor because of the organic certifications. She knows you cannot afford a prolonged legal battle. St. James is using her inside knowledge to orchestrate a rapid, devastating settlement. They take your land, sell it through the shell company at a massive profit, and leave you with nothing. Fergus closed the files, the light from the screen suddenly too bright to bear. The betrayal was absolute. It was a perfectly executed, calculated destruction of everything he loved. I need hard copies of all of this, Bouchard, Fergus said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper. I need undeniable proof of the shell company, the conflict of interest, and the affair. Everything that can destroy his career. It will be couriered to a secure locker in Avignon by tomorrow noon, Bouchard replied. What do you intend to do, Monsieur Hayes? Fergus looked down at the Italian fountain pen Jessamine had given him. He picked it up, feeling the cold, heavy weight of it. I intend to rewrite the deed to my farm, Fergus said softly. And then, I'm going to invite Julian St. James to the Harvest Festival. The Harvest Festival of St. Remy was 2 days away, and the air in the farmhouse was thick with the scent of boiling sugar and lavender as Jessamine prepared her annual batch of preserves. For years, this had been their favorite ritual, a sweet culmination of their hard work. Now, the sickly sweet smell only made Fergus's stomach churn. He sat at the kitchen island, a stack of heavily stamped documents spread out before him. The Italian fountain pen lay parallel to the paperwork, its polished surface catching the afternoon light. He watched Jessamine hum softly as she stirred the large copper pot, her movements practiced and relaxed. She was entirely at ease in the home she was secretly helping to dismantle. The figs are especially good this year, Ferge, she said, glancing over her shoulder. The golden tan from Corsica was beginning to fade, but the deceit in her bright eyes was as vibrant as ever. I was thinking we could send a few jars to Dorothea. A peace offering. It might soften her up before the next hearing. The sheer audacity of the suggestion nearly broke his composure. She was actively coaching him to appease the woman her lover represented. Fergus tightened his jaw, forcing a tired, appreciative smile. Maybe, he agreed mildly, tapping the papers. Though I think our best defense right now is getting our own house in order. I finally got those agricultural tax restructuring forms back from the notary in Avignon. Jessamine's stirring slowed for a fraction of a second. She turned off the burner and wiped her hands on a linen apron. The restructuring forms? I thought we were holding off on those until the boundary dispute was settled. We can't, Fergus lied smoothly, his voice devoid of any edge. The new organic certification requirements mandate a clear division of assets for liability purposes. If Dorothea somehow wins an injunction on the northern ridge, this structure protects the main house and the southern fields from being seized for legal fees. It essentially puts my half of the equity into a blind trust. He slid the top document toward her. It was dense with French legal jargon, deliberately obfuscated by the ruthless notary Fergus had hired alongside Bouchard. To a layman, it looked like a standard protective measure. In reality, it was an irrevocable deed of trust, transferring Jessamine's signing authority and her 50% stake in the property's decision-making power entirely to Fergus, effectively locking her out of any future sale or settlement negotiations with Julian's shell company. Jessamine approached the island, her brow furrowing slightly as she picked up the first page. Fergus's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He kept his hands flat on the table to hide their trembling. If she took this to Julian to review, the game was over. "It looks incredibly complicated," she murmured, scanning the preamble. "Are you sure this is necessary right now?" Julian mentioned at the village meeting that complex financial moves during a dispute can look suspicious to a judge. "Julian is Dorothea's lawyer, Jess," Fergus said, injecting just enough weary frustration into his voice to sound authentic. "His job is to make us feel insecure. This is standard procedure. The notary assured me it bulletproofs our remaining acres." He picked up the Italian fountain pen and held it out to her, the gold nib glinting. "I've already signed my sections. I just need your signature on the last 3 pages, where the tabs are." Jessamine hesitated, the pen hovering above the thick paper. For a terrifying, suspended moment, Fergus thought she was going to refuse. He saw the calculation in her eyes, the internal debate of whether this jeopardized her secret plans with Julian. "Sign it," Fergus screamed internally. "Sign away the farm you tried to steal." She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of deceit. But Fergus had spent the last 10 days mastering the art of the hollow man. He met her gaze with the exhausted, trusting eyes of a farmer who believed his wife was his only ally. "All right," Jessamine sighed, the tension leaving her shoulders. She uncapped the pen. "If you're sure it protects the main house." "I'm absolutely sure it protects what's mine," Fergus replied softly. She flipped to the first yellow tab and signed her name with a flourish. "Jessamine Hayes." She flipped to the second, then the third, the expensive nib scratching loudly against the heavy paper. With each stroke, she was legally severing her own access to the wealth she and Julian had planned to steal. "Done," she said, capping the pen and sliding the documents back across the island. "Now, how about a glass of wine before we start jarring the preserves?" Fergus gathered the papers, tapping them neatly against the wood to align the edges. A cold, absolute triumph settled over him, heavier and more profound than any grief. He had the land. Now, it was time to destroy the lawyer. "I'd love a glass, Jess," Fergus said, carefully placing the signed deed of trust into a secure manila envelope. "We have a lot to celebrate at the festival tomorrow." The annual St. Remy Harvest Festival was a riot of color, sound, and the sharp scent of crushed grapes and roasting garlic. String lights crisscrossed the ancient village square, casting a warm, deceptive glow over the cobblestones. The local band played an energetic, thumping accordion tune, drowning out the murmur of 100 conversations. Fergus stood near the edge of the square, nursing a small glass of pastis. He watched Jessamine through the crowd, her bright laughter carrying over the noise as she spoke with the village baker. She looked entirely relaxed, the picture of an innocent, devoted wife. It was a terrifying performance, one Fergus had learned to mirror perfectly. His eyes scanned the perimeter of the festival until they locked onto his target. Julian St. James stood near the VIP wine-tasting tent, looking remarkably out of place in his tailored navy blazer amidst the farmers and vineyard workers. He was swirling a glass of expensive red, his gaze sliding over the crowd with an air of practiced superiority. Every few minutes, his eyes would dart toward Jessamine, a subtle, proprietary look that made Fergus's knuckles go white around his glass. It was time. Fergus set his drink down on a nearby barrel and began navigating through the throng of people. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace, avoiding eye contact with the neighbors who usually stopped him to talk about crop yields. He needed Julian isolated. As he approached the wine tent, Julian noticed him. The lawyer's arrogant smile tightened slightly, replaced by a mask of professional, condescending sympathy. "Fergus," Julian greeted smoothly, raising his glass in a mock salute. "Enjoying the fruits of your labor?" The festival is exceptionally vibrant this year. A nice distraction from the stresses of the property dispute, I imagine. It is, Fergus agreed, his voice dangerously soft. He stepped closer, invading Julian's personal space just enough to make the lawyer shift uncomfortably. I was hoping to have a quick word with you, Julian. Privately. About the injunction Dorothea is filing on the northern ridge. Julian's eyes narrowed slightly, a predator sensing a shift in the wind. Fergus, you know I can't discuss the details of my client's case with you without your legal representation present. It's highly improper. What I have to discuss is highly improper for a number of reasons, Fergus replied, his tone devoid of any emotion. He gestured toward a narrow, shadowed alleyway behind the wine tent, away from the glaring string lights and the noise of the band. It will only take 2 minutes of your time, unless you'd prefer to have this conversation in front of the mayor and the village council. The veiled threat landed. Julian's polished facade cracked for a fraction of a second before he recovered, a cold, calculating gleam replacing his mock sympathy. He nodded curtly and followed Fergus into the damp, smelling shadows of the alley. The moment they were out of earshot, Fergus turned to face him. The ambient light from the square cast long, distorted shadows across the stone walls. "I'll make this quick, St. James," Fergus said, dropping the weary farmer act entirely. His voice was hard, a solid wall of ice. "I know about the Shell Corporation in Monaco. Société Civile Immobilière Laub." Julian froze. The confident posture vanished, replaced by a sudden, rigid tension. He opened his mouth to speak, to deploy his usual arsenal of legal obfuscation, but Fergus didn't give him the chance. "I have the incorporation documents," Fergus continued relentlessly, pulling a folded, thick envelope from the inside pocket of his canvas jacket. "I have the banking details. And I have the high-resolution photographs of you and my wife on a private yacht in Corsica, paid for with the farm's operating account." Julian stared at the envelope as if it were a loaded gun pointed directly at his chest. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his tan looking artificial and sickly in the dim light. "You have no idea what you're talking about, Hayes. This is absurd." "Don't insult my intelligence," Fergus growled, stepping forward until he was inches from Julian's face. The smell of expensive cologne was suddenly overpowering. "You're orchestrating a hostile land grab using inside financial information fed to you by my cheating wife. You set up a dummy corporation to buy the land from Dorothea the moment she wins the lawsuit. It's textbook predatory malpractice." Julian swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward the entrance of the alley. He was trapped. "What do you want, Fergus? Money? A settlement? I can talk to Dorothea." "I don't want Dorothea's money," Fergus interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "I want you to sabotage her case. I want you to file a motion to dismiss the boundary dispute on Monday morning, citing a fatal error in the original 1920s survey documents." Julian balked, his eyes widening in panic. "Are you insane? I can't do that. Dorothea will destroy me. She'll have me disbarred for incompetence." "If you don't do it," Fergus countered, tapping the envelope against Julian's chest, "I will take this file to the French Bar Association, the American Bar Association, and every major news outlet in Provence. You won't just be disbarred, Julian. You'll be prosecuted for fraud. Your career will end, your reputation will be ashes, and you'll spend the next decade drowning in legal fees." Fergus leaned in closer, the absolute finality of his threat hanging heavily in the damp air. "You're going to lose the northern ridge for Dorothea. And then, you're going to break Jessamine's heart. You're going to leave town without her." Julian looked at the man he had dismissed as a slow, ignorant dirt farmer. The realization that he had been entirely outmaneuvered, beaten at his own vicious game, shattered his arrogance completely. He was looking into the eyes of a man with absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to destroy. The Mistral wind had died down by Monday morning, leaving the village of St. Marie baking under a relentless, heavy sun. Jessamine sat in the small, sterile break room of her veterinary clinic, the smell of antiseptic doing nothing to settle the cold knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. It had been 48 hours since the harvest festival. Julian had vanished immediately after speaking with Fergus near the wine tent. He hadn't returned her texts. His phone went straight to voicemail. Her heart hammered against her ribs in a frantic, terrifying rhythm. Had Fergus said something? Had he found out? No, that was impossible. Fergus was a simple, trusting man obsessed with his soil. He couldn't possibly unravel the sophisticated legal and financial web Julian had spun around Laub. Her phone buzzed on the Formica table. The caller ID flashed Julian's name. Jessamine snatched it up, her breath catching in her throat. She locked the break room door with a trembling hand before answering. Julian? Where have you been? I've been terrified since Saturday night. What happened at the festival? There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. When Julian finally spoke, his voice was tight, clipped, and completely devoid of the smooth, arrogant charm that usually laced his words. It sounded as though he were speaking to a hostile witness in a courtroom. Jessamine, we need to end this. Immediately. The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. What? What are you talking about? And what? The lawsuit? Did Dorothea? I'm dropping Dorothea as a client. Julian interrupted, his tone sharp and frantic. I'm filing a motion to dismiss the boundary dispute this morning, citing a fatal error in the 1920 survey documents. I'm legally withdrawing from the case. The room seemed to tilt sickeningly. You're withdrawing? But our plan? The Northern Ridge? The shell company in Monaco? Julian, we were going to buy the land from Dorothea. You promised me. The plan is dead, Jessamine. He snapped, his voice rising in panic. The Monaco Shell Company is being dissolved as we speak. You need to forget it ever existed. I'm leaving Provence by the end of the week. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and humiliating. The sophisticated, passionate lover she had risked everything for was suddenly acting like a cornered rat. Why? Why are you doing this? What happened? Did Fergus? She couldn't finish the sentence. The sheer terror of Fergus knowing the truth paralyzed her. Julian let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. Your husband is not the idiot you told me he was, Jessamine. He knows everything. The Corsica trip, the credit card receipts, the Monaco incorporation documents. He has photographs. He has a private investigator's file thick enough to disbar me in 3 different countries. The phone nearly slipped from her sweaty grip. Her vision narrowed to a terrifying tunnel. Fergus knew. He knew about the affair. He knew about the theft. He had known for days, perhaps weeks, and he had sat at the kitchen table, looking at her with those calm, weary eyes, playing the part of the devoted fool while meticulously digging her grave. He blackmailed me, Jessamine. Julian continued, his voice dripping with venom. He forced me to tank Dorothea's case to save my own license. I'm ruined here. And if you have half a brain, you'll pack your bags and run before he turns his sights fully on you. Julian, wait. She sobbed, panic clawing at her throat. You can't just leave me. We love each other. We can fight this together. I can hire my own lawyer. I still have half the equity in Laub. The silence that followed was the coldest, most devastating sound she had ever heard. I never loved you, Jessamine, Julian said softly, the brutal truth finally stripping away the last remnants of their romance. You were an asset. You had inside access to Fergus's financial vulnerabilities, and you were willing to give it to me because you were bored. The equity in your farm was the only thing that made you interesting. And now, you don't even have that. The line clicked dead. Jessamine stood completely still, staring at the blank screen of her phone, the enormity of her mistake crashing over her like a tidal wave. She had traded her husband, her home, and her integrity for a man who saw her only as a stepping stone to a real estate deal. The golden tan from Corsica suddenly felt like a brand of absolute stupidity. She had to fix this. She had to go home, fall to her knees, and beg Fergus for forgiveness. She had to convince him that Julian had manipulated her, that she was a victim. She grabbed her keys and ran out of the clinic, completely unaware that she had already signed away the very farm she was rushing back to save. The drive back to Laub was a blur of panic and terror for Jessamine. She pushed her small Renault to its limits along the winding dirt roads, the dust billowing behind her like a shroud. She rehearsed her lines frantically. She would cry. She would explain how Julian had preyed on her vulnerabilities, how the stress of the boundary dispute had pushed her into a momentary lapse of judgment. She would beg Fergus to remember the early days, the dreams they had built together in the dirt. He was a good man. He loved her. He had to forgive her. She slammed the car into park near the stone barn and ran toward the farmhouse. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. "Fergus," she called out, her voice cracking with manufactured hysteria. She burst into the kitchen, tears already streaming down her face. "Fergus, please. We need to talk. I made a terrible mistake." Fergus was sitting at the heavy dining table, exactly where he had been when she signed the agricultural tax forms days ago. The kitchen was unnervingly quiet, save for the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. He didn't look up immediately. He was carefully arranging a stack of manila folders and a thick, sealed envelope on the polished wood. "I know, Jess," Fergus said softly, his voice devoid of anger or surprise. It was the calm, detached tone of a man assessing a blighted crop. Jessamine rushed to the table and fell to her knees beside his chair, grasping his rough, dirt-stained hand. "I was so stupid, Ferg. Julian St. James, he manipulated me. He twisted everything. I was so stressed about Dorothea taking the Northern Ridge, and he made me feel like he could fix it all. I was weak. It meant nothing to me. You have to believe me. I love you." Fergus slowly pulled his hand from her desperate grip. He looked down at her, his dark eyes entirely hollow. The tears tracking through the fading Corsican tan on her cheeks elicited absolutely zero sympathy in him. He had spent weeks imagining this moment, and now that it was here, the primary emotion he felt was a profound, exhaustion-laced disgust. "You didn't make a mistake, Jessamine," Fergus corrected, his voice as cold as the Mistral wind. "You made a calculation. You made hundreds of them. Every time you kissed me goodbye. Every time you checked our joint account to book a private yacht. Every time you smiled at me while feeding Dorothea's lawyer our financial vulnerabilities." Jessamine flinched as if struck. The facade of the victim shattered instantly. She scrambled backward slightly, her eyes widening in genuine terror. He told you about the shell company in Monaco?" "Julian didn't have to tell me anything," Fergus said, sliding the thick, sealed envelope toward her. It bore the heavy wax seal of the French Bar Association. "I hired an investigator the day I found the receipt for Les Falaces de Pienar Resort. While you were lounging in the Mediterranean, I was compiling a dossier on your lover's predatory malpractice." "Fergus, please," she sobbed, the reality of his meticulous planning crushing her. "We can fight him. We can save the farm. I'll testify against him if I have to. I'll help you ruin him." Fergus let out a short, humorless laugh. It was a terrifying sound in the quiet kitchen. "I don't need your help, Jess. Julian filed the motion to dismiss Dorothea's lawsuit this morning. He surrendered the Northern Ridge to me to save his own miserable career. He's leaving town." Jessamine stared at him, the full scope of his revenge dawning on her. He hadn't just discovered the affair, he had weaponized it. He had used her betrayal to win the war for the farm. "But the equity," she stammered, her voice dropping to a panicked whisper as her mind raced to find leverage. "Julian said the shell company was dead, but I still own half of Laub. We can sell it, Ferg. We can start over somewhere else. I'll give you whatever you want." Fergus reached for the stack of manila folders. He opened the top one and slid a crisp, heavily stamped document across the table. It was the agricultural tax form she had signed days ago with the Italian fountain pen she had bought for him. "You don't own half of Laub anymore, Jessamine," Fergus said softly, tapping the paper. "You signed an irrevocable deed of trust. You transferred all your decision-making power and equity into a blind trust that I control entirely. It was designed to protect the farm from Dorothea's lawsuit, but it works equally well against a hostile, cheating spouse." The blood drained completely from Jessamine's face. She looked at her own signature, black ink on white paper, the final nail in the coffin she had built for herself. She had handed him the weapon, and he had used it flawlessly. You tricked me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I protected my home," Fergus replied, standing up from the table. His towering frame cast a long, dark shadow over her kneeling figure. "You tried to steal it to buy a house in Monaco with a man who abandoned you the second his license was threatened. You traded everything for nothing, Jess." He walked to the front door and opened it, letting the bright, harsh sunlight spill into the hallway. "Pack your bags, Jessamine," Fergus commanded, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "The investigator is waiting outside. He will escort you off my property." The farmhouse bedroom, once a sanctuary of shared dreams and lavender-scented mornings, now felt like a sterile holding cell. Jessamine moved frantically between the heavy oak wardrobe and her vintage leather weekender bag, the same bag she had gleefully packed for Corsica less than a month ago. Her hands shook so violently she could barely fold a simple cotton blouse. Standing silently in the doorway, a lit cigarette dangling from his lips, was Bouchard. The private investigator Fergus had hired from Marseille watched her with the detached, cynical gaze of a man who had seen 1,000 ruined lives. He didn't speak. He didn't offer to help. His mere presence was a suffocating reminder that Fergus had anticipated every move, every lie, and every tear she might attempt. "I need my winter coats," Jessamine stammered, her voice thick with panic, pulling open a heavy drawer. "They're in the cedar chest in the hallway. I can't leave without them. Monsieur Hayes instructed me that you may take only what fits in your vehicle." Bouchard rumbled in heavily accented English, shifting his weight against the doorframe. "The rest of the property belongs to the trust. I suggest you focus on necessities, madam." The word madam dripped with a terrifying, professional courtesy. It was the title of a stranger, an intruder. Jessamine let out a choked sob, clutching a handful of expensive linen dresses she had bought specifically for Julian. She threw them onto the bed, the fabric tangling with the remnants of her shattered pride. She had traded the solid, unwavering love of a good man for the fleeting thrill of a shark in a tailored suit. And now, she was being evicted from her own life by a chain-smoking stranger while her husband stood victorious in the fields. She walked over to her vanity mirror, her reflection a horrifying mask of smeared mascara and fading, artificial tan. On the small silver tray lay her wedding band, a simple gold circle Fergus had bought with his first successful harvest. She reached for it, her fingers trembling, a sudden, desperate urge to take it with her as a reminder of what she had lost. "Leave the ring, madam." Bouchard's voice cut through the silence, sharp and uncompromising. "It is an asset of the estate." Jessamine froze. She slowly pulled her hand back, the cold metal of the ring suddenly feeling like a heavy, accusatory weight. She had desecrated the vow it represented in a luxury villa overlooking the Mediterranean. She had no right to it now. She grabbed her weekender bag, shoving her toiletries and a few practical sweaters inside, her movements sharp and jerky with suppressed hysteria. She zipped the bag shut with a harsh, tearing sound. It was the only luggage she had left. As she walked toward the bedroom door, Bouchard stepped aside, his expression entirely unreadable. He gestured down the hallway with a slight nod of his head. "After you, madam." The walk down the stairs felt like an execution march. The silence in the farmhouse was absolute, heavy with the phantom echoes of laughter and shared meals that would never happen again. When she reached the kitchen, Fergus was nowhere to be seen. The heavy oak table where she had signed away her equity was completely clear, wiped clean of any trace of her deceit. She pushed open the heavy front door, the blinding sunlight of Provence hitting her like a physical blow. The air smelled of crushed lavender and damp soil, the scent of Fergus's life, a life she was no longer a part of. Her Renault was parked in the gravel driveway, looking small and pathetic against the backdrop of the sprawling, beautiful farm. She threw her bag into the trunk and slammed it shut, the sound echoing sharply against the stone barn. She turned around, expecting to see Fergus standing on the porch, a final, triumphant smirk on his face. But the porch was empty. Fergus had not even come out to watch her leave. He was already back in the fields, working the land that he had fought so ruthlessly to protect from her. He had excised her from his life with the surgical precision of a farmer cutting away a diseased branch. Jessamine climbed into the driver's seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. She started the engine, the familiar hum doing nothing to drown out the absolute silence of her defeat. As she drove slowly down the long, winding dirt road away from Laub, she looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The stone farmhouse stood resolute against the horizon, strong and impenetrable, a monument to the man she had underestimated and the home she had thrown away for a lie. The office of the local notary in Saint Marie was small, smelling faintly of old paper and strong espresso. The wooden chairs were uncomfortable, designed for brief, practical transactions, not the protracted dismantling of a 7-year marriage. Dust motes danced lazily in the shafts of afternoon sunlight that cut through the half-drawn blinds. Fergus sat on one side of the heavy oak desk, his posture perfectly rigid. He wore a simple, clean button-down shirt, his hands resting flat on the table, the calluses prominent against the smooth wood. He looked tired, but the deep lines around his eyes spoke of a man who had weathered a violent storm and emerged entirely hollowed out, yet standing. Across from him sat Jessamine. The radiant, sun-kissed woman who had returned from Corsica weeks ago was gone. In her place was a pale, trembling ghost. She wore a simple gray sweater, her hair pulled back hastily, the dark circles under her eyes a testament to sleepless nights in a cheap motel outside Avignon. She looked small, entirely stripped of the arrogant confidence she had wielded when she thought she and Julian were outsmarting him. Between them lay a thick stack of legal documents. The divorce decree. The final severance of the Société Civile Immobilière Lobby Trust, solidifying Fergus's sole ownership of the farm. The elderly notary, Monsieur Dupuis, cleared his throat uncomfortably, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He had known them since they arrived in Provence, bright-eyed and full of dreams. The documents are in order. Monsieur Hayes, madam, if you would please review the terms of the dissolution one final time before signing. Fergus didn't need to review them. He had drafted every line with a ruthlessness that would have made Julian St. James proud. He picked up the heavy black pen provided by the notary and signed his name with firm, deliberate strokes. He pushed the papers across the desk toward Jessamine. She stared at the stark black ink, her hands trembling so violently she had to clench them in her lap. She looked up at Fergus, her eyes swimming with fresh, humiliating tears. "Fergus, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. It was a pathetic sound, devoid of the manipulative edge she had tried to use in the kitchen. It was the sound of true, crushing defeat. "I know I don't deserve it, but I have nothing. Julian left me with legal bills for the clinic. I'm bankrupt. I can barely afford the motel." Fergus looked at her, his expression a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. He felt no surge of triumph, no vindictive joy. He felt only a profound, heavy silence. "You had everything, Jessamine," Fergus said softly, the words landing like stones in the quiet room. "You had a home. You had a partner who would have burned the world down to keep you warm. You traded it for a few nights in a luxury suite and a lie about a house in Monaco." "I was stupid," she sobbed, a single tear escaping and tracking down her pale cheek, falling onto the pristine legal paper. "I was bored, and I let him make me feel powerful. I didn't think you would ever find out. I didn't think you were paying attention to anything but the dirt." Fergus let out a slow, measured breath. "That was your fatal mistake, Jess. You thought because my hands were in the soil, my eyes were closed. I saw everything. I saw you pull away. I saw the greed when Julian talked about Dorothea's money. I watched you pack that leather bag, knowing exactly whose bed you were going to sleep in." He leaned slightly forward, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that seemed to echo in the small office. "I didn't trick you into signing away the farm. I simply gave you the rope, and you tied the knot yourself because you were too arrogant to read the fine print of your own betrayal." Jessamine flinched, the brutal truth of his words stripping away her last shred of defense. She was not a victim of Julian's manipulation. She was an active, willing participant in her own destruction. "Sign the papers, Jessamine," Fergus commanded softly. "Your lover is gone. Your equity is gone. The only thing left is your signature." She slowly reached for the heavy black pen, her hand shaking so badly she could barely grip it. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the weight of 7 years of history being permanently erased. She pressed the nib to the paper. A tear fell from her chin, splashing directly onto the signature line, blurring the ink slightly as she wrote her name for the final time. Jessamine Hayes. With that final stroke, she severed her connection to Laub, to the man she had loved, and to the life she had systematically dismantled. Monsieur Dupuis carefully blotted the wet ink with a heavy brass tool. The single teardrop that had fallen from Jessamine's chin had warped the thick, fibrous parchment, forever immortalizing her grief over the exact letters that ended their marriage. The sharp, heavy thud of the notary's official seal echoed in the small, dusty room like the final strike of a hammer on a coffin nail. It was done. The Société Civile Immobilière Laub was legally dismantled, the deed was irrevocably transferred into Fergus's sole possession, and their union was officially severed. Jessamine remained frozen in the uncomfortable wooden chair. She stared down at her copy of the divorce decree. More tears spilled from her hollowed eyes, splashing silently onto the cold, unforgiving legal text. She had no lawyer to fight for her, no wealthy lover to sweep her away to Monaco, no home to return to, and absolutely no future in the unforgiving landscape of Provence. Julian St. James had fled back across the border into Italy the moment his malpractice was threatened, leaving her to face the devastating, isolating consequences of a game she had never possessed the intellect to truly play. Dorothea, the wealthy vulture who had orchestrated the initial land grab, had quietly withdrawn her lawsuit, furious but legally paralyzed by Julian's abrupt resignation. Dorothea would survive, returning to her pristine manor to plot her next acquisition. Jessamine, however, was entirely ruined. Fergus stood up slowly from his side of the heavy oak desk. The physical, back-breaking exhaustion of the autumn harvest and the dark, mental toll of his meticulous revenge finally settled deep into his bones. He felt incredibly old. He reached across the desk and picked up his official copy of the paperwork, carefully folding the thick sheets and placing them into the inside breast pocket of his canvas jacket. The weight of the paper against his chest was a heavy, physical reminder of the ultimate cost of his survival. He looked down at the woman sitting across from him. There was no fiery hatred left in his heart, no burning desire to inflict further pain. There was only a vast, echoing emptiness, as barren as a field salted to prevent new growth. The bright, passionate veterinarian he had fallen in love with in a crowded Chicago coffee shop felt like a distant phantom, a fleeting character from a tragedy he had read a lifetime ago. "What do I do now, Ferge?" Jessamine whispered to the tear-stained paper, her shoulders trembling violently. She did not dare to look up at him. Her voice was a fragile, broken thing, entirely stripped of the arrogant deception she had worn like armor upon her return from Corsica. "Where am I supposed to go?" "That is no longer my concern, Jessamine," Fergus replied, his voice a quiet, flat baritone. He turned and walked toward the door of the office, his heavy work boots sounding loud and rhythmic against the ancient wooden floorboards. He paused with his rough, calloused hand resting on the tarnished brass doorknob. Outside the frosted glass, the harsh Provençal sun beat down mercilessly on the cobblestone streets, and the Mistral wind rustled violently through the plane trees, entirely indifferent to their human suffering. Fergus thought of Laub. He pictured the rich, dark soil he had cultivated, the thriving, silvery olive groves, and the heavy stone walls of the farmhouse that now belonged entirely, undisputedly, to him. He had won the war. He had executed a flawless defense, protecting his life's work from the thieves who had smiled to his face while plotting his ruin. Yet, as he looked back over his shoulder one final time, watching his ex-wife sit in the dim, dusty light, her tears continuously falling onto the finalized divorce decree that lay between them, he felt the true, staggering weight of his bitter victory. The acreage was secure, the boundaries were defended, but the home they had built upon it was entirely dead. "We kept the land, Jessamine," Fergus said softly into the quiet room, his words carrying the heavy, haunting sorrow of 1,000 ruined harvests. "But we buried us underneath it." He opened the door and stepped out into the blinding, unforgiving sunlight, leaving her entirely alone in the shadows, staring at the wet ink of her own destruction.